You're listening to Making the Cut, the mostly true life story of a retired surgeon from 1C Productions.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Seitz, founder and president of 1C Productions. This episode contains explicit language and adult content. It is intended for mature audiences only.
As I grew older, I realized that sex is not only a biological act that is linked to a very complicated set of emotions. In most people, sex is closely related to how we feel about ourselves and our bodies. Our upbringing contributes to this complexity, but this took years for me to understand.
Another letter arrived. This one was from my own doctor. He invited me to visit him in his practice office in Camden Town, 20 minutes from our flat. Thankful for his help during my bout with mononucleosis and curious to know what this was about, I went at once. We met in his upstairs examining room.
I hope you're feeling better than the last time I saw you.
Yes, much. Thank you for your help when I was sick.
Thank you for coming out in this awful rain.
Of course.
Can I interest you in a sherry?
No, thank you.
You were quite ill.
I was, indeed.
The Epstein-Barr herpes virus spreads primarily by saliva. Some kiss, eh?
Have you ever seen patients get lymphoma or head and neck cancer later in life from this virus, as is commonly taught?
No, I wouldn't worry about it.
I studied him, trying to read his mood and what was on his mind. In the darkening room, his face caught the orange streetlight coming through the window, dramatizing his suddenly contorted face into something resembling a gargoyle.
I found this man lying between my wife's legs, kissing her. Disgusting.
My book knowledge had not covered this type of confession. What could I say?
Disgusting. Kissing her. Down there.
A vision of Hannah rose up before me. Delicious. Desirable.
I need a break. 6 weeks. To figure things out. Will you do a locum for me? I'll pay you £36 per week.
I jerked back from thoughts of Hannah. Could I help him? I had already arranged to do an anatomy proctorship with Professor Aitken at University College. After that would be the lecture series at the Royal College of Surgeons, Lincoln's Inn Fields, followed by sitting for the surgical primary fellowship exams after Christmas. How would such an interruption impinge on my studying and preparing for the primary exam? But he was suffering because some man had done with his wife exactly what I now did with Hannah. Was this some sort of cosmic karma making me pay? Working for him, though, might affect my already limited time with Victoria. A small voice whispered back to me that I might have more time for Victoria if I cut out time with Hannah. Which brought me back to wondering if I didn't have some sort of karmic obligation to help Dr. B out. I'm just thinking it through a moment, Dr. B.
It's a very nice practice. Come here from 9 to 12 and 3 to 6. Jenny, my office manager, copes with the patients, paperwork, and the office. She's good. Makes things easy for me. I can arrange that you're not on weekend calls and you can have the practice's car at your disposal. By the way, twice a week you'll cover Grosvenor House. It's an upscale hotel along Park Lane for medical emergencies between 5 in the evening and 8 in the morning. It's good money. You'll get to bill the patients directly.
I had an opportunity to do some sort of right in an area where I so often did wrong. Perhaps this could make up for my relationship with Hannah in some way. I'll be happy to help.
Marvelous. You'll start Monday.
"10 minutes before Jenny unlocked the practice door. She stood next to me at Dr. B's desk, pointing to a stack of weathered and well-fingered index cards and telling me all I needed to know was on each card. As the morning progressed with one patient after another, I realized there was little I could do other than write prescriptions or refer patients to consultants at UCH. My frustration level gradually rose. This was not my type of medicine, not my type of job. I drove home in the practice's car. Walking into our empty flat, I dropped my bag and tried to telephone Victoria. I wanted to hear her voice, to feel close to her, to feel her presence, to ground me after a frustrating day. I needed her. A nurse answered and took a message. The next day I arrived early, primarily to get a parking space in front of the practice on High Street. Jenny was already preparing the 3x5 records of the patients I was to see. It proceeded exactly as the first. Boring. I was a cog in a wheel, not really treating, just moving patients on down the treadmill of medicine. My next patient, Mr. Partridge, had a surgical belly which had cramps and bleeding stools, complications from long-standing ulcerative colitis, dutifully enunciated by the wife who accompanied him. Based on my examination, I suspected he probably had an abscess in his abdomen that needed draining. I dashed off a brief note addressed to the casualty physician at UCH with a sense of pride at having made a worthy diagnosis, and one that required proper surgical intervention. I wished I could do the procedure myself. By the end of my first week, I became a connoisseur of mainly trivial and medico-social complaints, dispensing pills and sick notes, treating coughs, colds, and psychosomatic ailments. Anything vaguely surgical or of interest to me was referred to the hospital. During the following weeks, I settled into Dr. B's medical practice and managed to develop a limited study routine. I was not investing as much time into my preparations as I should, though, and I knew it. Did I fear failure so much that I would sabotage myself? One evening after I'd gone home for the day, a family in suite 2432 at the Grosvenor House telephoned for a doctor. Mr. Erdman told me his 15-year-old son Timothy's stomachache had worsened over the last 4 hours. Could I come as soon as possible? When I arrived, Timothy lay on the bedspread, parents hovering anxiously about. Timothy's eyes apprehensively tracked my approach as his father ushered me into the suite. The family had driven down from Yorkshire, starting shortly after an early breakfast. They'd planned a night at the West End Theatre, front row seats for Hair, followed by dinner at the Savoy.
We thought we'd show him some of the finer sides of life, now that he's becoming a man. Tomorrow, both my men are heading to Savile Row.
Mr. Erdman stood by her, wordlessly weighing me up. Had he expected an elderly physician?
Timmy didn't eat his lunch, but drank a little glucosade, felt nauseated, then lay in the back seat of the Bentley.
My shoes sank into the deep pile carpet, a level of luxury I had not seen in any of the hotels within my budget. Timmy's eyes were sunken, and his face clammy. He told me that he'd eaten breakfast, fried eggs, fried tomato, fried black pudding and fried bread, just to please his mum, even though it was tasteless. He hadn't had his usual morning bowel movement. When I asked where it had started hurting, he pointed to the area about his belly button. He thought his nausea was due to car sickness because of his dad's new Bentley, but he'd never suffered from it before. When his father had made a pit stop in Cambridge, he had not felt like getting out of the car to visit his uncle's college. Neither the chapel nor the stained glass windows nor the manicured gardens held any charm for him. Timothy's temperature was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. After I examined his throat for tonsillitis, I listened to his lungs and heart. He moved his hand to the lower right side of his belly and told me the pain had moved there now. I gently started to examine Timothy's abdomen, constantly talking to him and asking him about school, his hobbies and friends, to distract him while intently watching his face for signs of pain induced by my examination. Throughout, Mr. Erdman and his wife watched apprehensively from the foot of the bed, occasionally exchanging a quiet word or two. I palpated the right lower quadrant progressively deeper and saw the pain reflected in Timothy's face. I suddenly released the pressure and Timothy groaned. I'm sorry. I meant it. I knew exactly how he felt. Mr. and Mrs. Erdman, I suspect that your son has appendicitis. He will need an emergency operation. I recommend Mr. Rodney Mengott, the most eminent consultant abdominal surgeon in London. Sensing that Mr. and Mrs. Erdman seemed apprehensive of my youth, I suggested they confer with their GP back home about my referral. Mr. Erdman returned with the GP's blessing. By now it was 6:30 p.m., the height of private surgical consultation hours. I phoned Mr. Mengott in Harley Street, maneuvering past his protective office manager.
This is Mr. Mengott.
Hello, this is Dr. McGead. I'm a GP locum. Pleased to speak with you. I want to refer a patient to you who on my exam has acute appendicitis, febrile, 101 Fahrenheit, nausea, periumbilical pain radiating to the right lower quadrant. Not stool, but tender right side birectal.
I agree. It sounds like appendicitis. My secretary will arrange for Timothy's admission to St. George's Hospital and get an operating room scheduled. Tell the parents I'll be there around 8 p.m.
I will do that.
Would you like to assist me?
Would I? Jubilation coursed through me, more at the prospect of meeting my abdominal hero than the prospect of the appendectomy, truth be told. I headed home to our flat in Albany Street, in the dark of London's post-rush hour traffic. Victoria was on duty, so there was no dinner. I made a cup of tea, grabbed a scone, and pulled Mr. Mengott's well-worn book, Abdominal Operations, off the shelf. I started to reread Chapter 52, The Treatment of Acute Appendicitis, with its step-by-step instructions and accompanying line diagrams of the operation. For me, the stakes were high as this was no longer a theoretical exercise. This was it, the real thing. I met the great man himself in the surgeon's changing room. He was of medium height, with the paunch of prosperity, and spoke softly but with authority. He thanked me for the referral, and said he'd already met the Erdmans and examined Timothy. We changed into green scrubs and donned our caps. As I stood in front of the sink, I glanced through the glass window to see Timothy already anesthetized on the operating table. Fluids ran through an intravenous drip into his veins, rehydrating him. He received a push of antibiotics to help his natural immune system kill off the bacteria infecting his appendix. The scrub nurse washed his lower abdomen, painted it with an antiseptic, and draped it with sterile green towels. Covering the rest of his body with sterile sheets.
Would you like to take out the appendix?
Thrilled, I held the scalpel like the bow of a violin and proceeded to make a 3 to 4 inch McBurney's skin incision. Using 2 retractors, Mr. Mengot pulled back the skin and subcutaneous fat while simultaneously blotting the bleeders. I incised the external oblique muscle, the very incision I had difficulty explaining to Ingrid a few years earlier. Mr. Mengot moved the retractors deeper, carefully stretching the dark red muscle fibers apart, widening the incision. As the deeper layers were incised, the retractors followed, placed deeper and stretching the tissues farther apart. We were like well-rehearsed dancers, complementing each other's steps. We did not speak. I merely followed my mental map from Chapter 52, guided by the master surgeon. I stared at the abdominal contents, spellbound by the body's beauty. I wanted to tell the guts that I had missed them. My last glimpse of the abdomen was at Mass General in Boston. So much had happened since then. I was nudged out of my reverie by the scrub nurse, who handed me moist gauze lap pads to wall off the coils of the writhing pink and healthy-looking small bowel, isolating the glistening beige-colored cecum and the appendix. Touching the tissues added to my sensuous elation, while operating in my favorite domain gave me an addictive high, better than sex. The scrub nurse slapped a Babcock clamp into my palm. It was designed to encircle the appendix without crushing it, as a means to hold it. I applied it about the appendix, which was about 5 centimeters long. Its encapsulating blood vessels were inflamed, the tissue infected, its necrotic tip looked bluish-green and smelled like ripe gorgonzola. Even so, I saw it as a thing of beauty. I applied a second Babcock clamp. Tugging slightly on both, I cautiously eased the appendix to the center of the open wound and started to free it from its tethered tissues. I was about to use Metzenbaum scissors handed to me to sever the tissue when Mr. Mengut interceded.
Give him a scalpel, nurse. You don't cut your steak with scissors, do you? Always use the knife. You're a surgeon.
I divided the tissue, thereby completely freeing up the appendix. The operation proceeded in silence, save for the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor. I tied off the proximal cut margins of the mesoappendix with thin silk ligatures, while Mr. Mengot released each clamp. The nurse placed a needle holder loaded with a black silk suture swedged onto a needle in my hand. I used it to place a purse-string suture in the cecum surrounding the appendix, and returned the clamp with the needle in its jaws to the nurse. Every choreographed move was designed to avoid an inadvertent stab or cut to a team member, thereby preventing the risk of transmitting hepatitis or other diseases. Keeping my vision focused on the structures, I merely held out my right hand, and the scrub placed a knife into it. I was operating in the lap of luxury. No talk, just hand signals with the scrub, knowing exactly what I wanted. I cut between the 2 clamps at the base of the appendix and excised it, handing it off to her. Mr. Mengot grunted his approval. Using the electric bovie, he coagulated the stump. Using forceps, Mr. Mengot dunked the stump into the base of the cecum as I tugged tight the purse string and tied it off, and removed the lap pads in the wound. The circulating nurse started to count them, as well as the number of needles used to ensure we'd left none in the abdomen. The anesthetist stared at us over the drape as if to signal that we were wasting his time. So I proceeded to close the peritoneum. After I tied off the final stitch, Mr. Mengot indicated to the scrub by merely raising his right eyebrow that he wanted to irrigate the wound between each layer. She provided warm, sterile saline in a small basin, which he poured into the wound. Bits of white fat and tissue debris floated to the surface. I sucked out the irrigation fluid and debris using the sucker. Mr. Mengot then sponged the wound, again using lap pads. He was averse to using the traditionally provided 3x3 gauze sponges to avoid the unforgivable sin of accidentally overlooking one inside the patient. A needle holder with a silk suture was placed in my hand.
Interrupted sutures.
He wanted the gridiron incision to be closed with non-continuous sutures. As I did this, Mr. Mengot cut on top of each knot, thus moving the operation along rapidly until I loosely closed the skin. "13 years to the day when my appendix was removed in Cairo, and 50 years after King George VI had his removed in this very same operating theatre at St. George's Hospital, I performed my first appendectomy to cure a fellow human. I could not think of a greater sacrament that I could contribute to humanity. I was overcome with a sense of humility. Timothy's anesthetic was reduced, and he began to wake up. The anesthetist recorded wound closure time as 9:16 p.m., blood loss as minimal, and a correct sponge count. Mr. Mengot applied a dry, sterile dressing to the skin incision, writing on it the date and time.
Oh, well done. You did that with the alacrity of uprooting a turnip.
Mr. Mengot had baptized me. I was a surgeon, well, of sorts. I wouldn't officially be a surgeon until I earned my stripes via the primary exam, followed by the fellowship exam. Nevertheless, I had used the scalpel to heal a patient. Driving home, I determined anew to heal myself and to rid myself of past demons. I was relieved when Dr. B came back on a Friday evening. After Jenny said her goodbyes, we sat in his office while he sipped his glass of sherry.
Well, how was it? Jenny said you did well. Ready to join me as a partner?
I still have my sights set on surgery if I pass the primary fellowship. But I learned a hell of a lot of practical medicine, for which I thank you. He dropped me off at my flat with a wave of his hand as I stepped into the night's rain. Looking up, the lights were not on in our flat. I missed Victoria already, for I wanted to share my triumph with her. I wanted to dance, to laugh, to celebrate. I called Hannah. I took Hannah to the only haunt I knew where we could freely hop and bob and occasionally dance close during a slow number. The University College Saturday Night Hop. Unlike Victoria 3 years ago, Hannah got into the rhythm and mood of the present and danced like crazy. How I wish this was my Victoria. A couple of former classmates stood on the periphery of the dance floor, drinks in hand. One locked eyes with me. He leaned toward his companion.
Hey, he's married to Victoria!
We left. At movies, I worried someone would make out our outlines in the darkened theater. At restaurants, I constantly scanned the room looking for acquaintances. I told little white lies to get out of an uncomfortable situation, whether to Hannah or Victoria. A strategy to avoid suspicion set in for Hannah. No perfume, no lipstick, no makeup, and no hickeys. Being Catholic, Hannah didn't feel comfortable with contraception, preferring to depend on the rhythm method. While that would free me from buying condoms and finding hiding places for them, it wouldn't do for her to become pregnant. She agreed to the pill which I prescribed for her monthly. I started taking us to places far removed and in the unlikely path of people who might know either of us. The deception and danger of being spotted got to me. Why did I keep doing this? Why couldn't I stop? Every time I left Hannah, I vowed it would be the last time. And yet, like a moth to a flame, I flew back to her again and again. I churned with anger at myself and fear of the jeopardy I seemed helpless to create. The pain, the symptom of cheating and lying, could not be cut out to heal like in surgery. When Victoria announced she had a weekend free from her studies and duties and suggested we leave town for the Isle of Serenity, I grabbed it and her like a lifeline. My self-imposed burden of guilt and shame lightened with each mile from London. The relief was overwhelming as I shed the other me I'd created. Alone with my wife once more, we travelled into the past where we had loved so freely. I told myself again that my dallying had to stop. But we couldn't stay at the Isle forever. Eventually, we had to return to our life in London, her to her work and studies, me to preparing for the upcoming exam. On the occasional night that Victoria came home, she wanted a hot bath to unwind and a meal while she read in preparation for her next day conference. She crashed into bed to catch up on lost sleep. Sex wasn't even a consideration. Only a few days back from the Isle, and self-pity creeped back in. Here I sat, home alone every day in our tiny flat, facing dry anatomy, physiology, and pathology books. I was bored, not motivated to study for the surgical exams in a few months. Loneliness hung about me like an albatross. I wanted Hannah, but hesitated calling her. I feared becoming emotionally dependent on her, for I repeatedly reminded myself Victoria was my only love, my true love, my wife, my future, the woman who would bear my children. I believed it in my heart and desperately wanted to be faithful and loyal to her, but was terrified she would become mother, abandoning me to a life alone. I could not fathom being alone any longer. I called the communal phone number she had given me.
Hello.
It's me.
Hello, me.
I've been thinking of you. Can't stop thinking of you, actually.
Is that so?
I was thinking perhaps we could meet early in the morning at Westminster Pier. Take a Thames riverboat to Hampton Court. The weatherman is promising a clear sky. Fearing the danger of being recognized heightened my nervousness. But when Hannah came toward me at the pier looking awesome and beaming with delight, my nerves fell away. She wore a short-sleeved sweater and a skirt I had never seen before. When she got close, her fragrance boosted my lusty feelings. It wasn't strong, perhaps a hangover from one of her nights out. Her smile lifted my heart and dissipated the dark thoughts and my gnawing loneliness as fast as a cloud passing overhead on a windy day. Her joy reinvigorated my enthusiasm for life and for her. You look lovely. I've missed you so much.
Yeah? One would know it.
She winked, but her sarcasm was annoying at first. I soon recognized that it was her way of defensively expressing her affection. A defensive sort of trust, uncertain of the future. We sat on the upper deck of the riverboat, taking in the changing scenery as we headed north. We passed Parliament, leafy suburbia, bombed-out lots, decaying industrial lots, the bridges and the locks, travelling along the course of my previous Thames boat race and getting our fill of sunshine. We sat mostly in silent stillness, my arm occasionally about her shoulder when the wind made her shiver. I wondered what she was thinking about, but did not want to ask, fearing to disturb the peaceful quiet and wanting to avoid the touchy questions we'd lately begun to ask, like hers of, "Do you sleep with your wife?" and mine of, "Where and with whom do you go out at night?" Instead, I drew her close to steal kisses. I was jealous of a life outside her nursing schedule, since she didn't share it with me, no more than I had the chance of sharing my non-surgical life. I suspected her of searching for another man. Could only imagine to what lengths she might go for that. The trip took around 3 hours. She was on evening duty starting at 3 in the afternoon. Once we arrived, we didn't linger at Hampton Court or buy a souvenir to capture this moment of bliss and sanity. We hurried to the tube and got back to London. She must have wondered what was in store in our relationship, for when we parted, I vaguely promised I'd contact her again. I didn't allow myself to wonder, too caught up in promising myself that this time would be the last. Seeing Hannah energized me, though. It filled my empty emotional and physical need tank. The next morning, I contentedly returned to bashing the books and rereading my old notes on any of the basic sciences and made significant headway in my day's study schedule. I decided my relationship with Hannah must not be all bad, as it enabled me to be less dependent on Victoria and, with my anxiety assuaged, successfully focus on my studies. So, for the long weekends when Victoria was on call, I allowed myself to meet Hannah in Greenwich Park, near Blackheath, in southeast London, a district I was sure provided anonymity. Its gentle, tumbling hills with panoramic views overlooked the old Royal Naval College, Greenwich Hospital, and on the opposite embankment of the Thames, the City of London and Canary Wharf. We ambled through the grove of ancient chestnut trees as the late morning mist rose from the grass into their canopies. Since there were no leash laws, dogs ran about, ignoring their owners' calls when chasing squirrels or the occasional deer. Like the dogs, I felt free of the constraints imposed by marriage and sensed the pleasure of escaping my duty to study. Eventually, we made our way out of the walled park to Mother's nearby flat, careful to avoid her neighbors. Mother was overseas, either in Germany or Egypt or maybe even somewhere else. I couldn't keep track of her movements. Her infrequent letters announced her past travel and her next destination, but they were too long with gossip to maintain my attention. She let me know she hoped that I was doing fine, but she never asked if that were actually the case. Mother had set up a guest room that she insisted was for my use. I do not know what use she envisioned me having for it, since I was a married man with a place of my own. I took my books and revision schedule to a flat. The table in the guest room brimmed over with notes, open books, and occasionally spent cups of coffee. I also brought Hannah there. We settled in Mother's kitchen, mainly in silence as our sexual tension rose. Would you like a cup of tea?
Do you have anything stronger?
Let's see. Mother kept a bottle of gin in this cupboard. Ah, there it is. Want some?
Yes.
You'll have to take it neat, I'm afraid.
That's all right.
Here, I'll pour it into a teacup.
Warming me up.
You're hot enough without the gin. I made myself tea even though there was no milk in Mother's refrigerator. With the pretense of tea done, we drifted to my room, where I slowly stripped her of her clothes, item by item, to the notes of expressed pleasure and approval enhanced by passionate kisses, exploring tongues, and fumbling fingers. Afterward, we lay together exhausted, neither of us caring about the world still turning outside. We were connected. Our bodies smelled of one another as we breathed in unison. My mind drifted to a patient I'd had who did not want to disclose his condition or medication to his boss. Can you imagine he wanted me to conspire with him to deceive Esso about his illicitly taking medications for fear it might prejudice his future? How mendacious of him. Hannah turned to me, her head propped up on her elbow.
And did you?
Of course not. That's being deceitful. Suppose he had a seizure, or a TIA leading to an accident where oil would gush out of his tanker, polluting the sea. What a disaster! Could you imagine the upshots when his dishonesty is discovered? And I'd be in cahoots with him.
So, what happened?
I told him I couldn't do it. He should face reality and be honest, because the consequences of not doing so had serious penalties. He would be cheating the company.
It's like you. You're the captain and I'm the tanker full of your semen.
Now it was I who propped my head on my elbow and looked at her inquisitively.
Isn't it the same?
The word adultery crossed my mind. I suppressed it. This wasn't cheap adultery. This was me trying to not feel deserted for once.
The echo of Mother's footfalls, fading on the stairs as she was leaving without saying goodbye, now filled the room as I watched the taxi's lights on the curtains disappear into the night. The torment of her abandonment was still excruciating, no matter how many times I said I was over it. I was no longer that helpless 4-year-old child, but I was still lost and seeking comfort. Was this the reason I clung to Hannah while wanting Victoria? Give me a knife so I can cut out this addiction.
Thanks for listening to this project from 1C Productions, where thought-provoking media comes alive. Be sure to check out other 1C shows like Freevangelic, in which a married couple discuss their walk out of lifelong evangelicalism and into a new way of being. Their search for truth might open doors for you as well. Learn about Freevangelic and other 1C Productions podcasts at just1c.com. That's JUSTONEC.com.
You've been listening to Making the Cut from 1C Productions. Making the Cut was written, produced, and directed by Rebecca Seitz, based on Michael McGead's manuscript, Mastering the Knife. Noah James played Michael McGead. Other voices brought to life by the vocal talents of Drew DeCarvalho, Kay Alluvian, James Smiley, and Laurie Russo. Audio engineering provided by Zisher LLC. Making the Cut theme music by Kyle J. Baker. Learn more at makingthecutpodcast.com.